A very brief update, and I was going to give around the science program just to round that out, conclude the view of the pond. We are aware there's a broader interest in a conversation around the estuary more generally. The thinking was that today's discussion was just about the science update, and that we are looking at options to bring back to you a more fulsome discussion of the catchment and the broader issues at some further point, including the possibility of a workshop and potentially bringing in others into that conversation. So,
councillors may have noted my email of Friday where I referenced the fact that we've written to the Napier City Council asking them for a detailed work program, including budgets and timelines around the stormwater and wastewater issues as they relate to the estuary. And so what we want to bring back to you is a comprehensive picture of what is being proposed. And there's also, of course, the tank moving parts, the Tukituki management plan. We're meeting with Mana Hariri on Friday. So there are these kind of shifting parts at the moment, and we want to bring it back to you so you can get a full, comprehensive picture of what is being proposed and undertaken in relation to the estuary.
So just in relation to that, what are actually our rights is not the right word, but their obligation to provide us with any more than what's in the public arena, for example? I mean, that would just come down to our relationship, or is there some statutory teeth at the back of this? I just need to understand this.
So there's a couple of things. The first of which is there is a package of resource consents being sought in relation to the stormwater network into the estuary, and that's going through the consenting process at the moment. The consents actually haven't been lodged, but they've been prepared and they're in their final phase of pre-consultation with stakeholders, including tangata whenua. That process is a normal resource consenting process, and we can request whatever additional information we require. There's a broader package of investment that is planned by Napier City Council, and there was a very high-level presentation given to the council at the end of last year on that. What we're seeking now is firmer commitments in more detail, and the context of that is, at least in part, the recurring breaches that we've had, or non-compliance that we've had in relation to their wastewater network and infiltration from the stormwater network. So we've got a degree of leverage, I would say, over them in terms of them supplying us with further information. But it's not something at this point in time that we're using any draconian compliance kind of requirement over them, or seeking a court order or anything like that in terms of them providing that information to us. And I don't have any reason to believe that they won't be fully forthcoming.
Thank you.
Just further to that, the Tranche Street discharge consent, which we were supposed to have a catchment plan or a plan come back to us for, I'm pretty certain it was by June last year. Has that been finished, completed yet?
I thought I had. I don't know. Can you remember the management plan?
There is a draft management plan. I don't know that it's been finalised. The group hasn't met for a while, but I can chase that up with Napier City Council because we should be meeting.
Well, so they're non-compliant with their consent?
Well, I couldn't guarantee if it's draft. Oh, sorry. I'm not 100% sure if it's in draft or in final at this point. But it has been, the progress has been being made. I can certainly double check with that, with Tanya, and get back to you as to whether or not the final catchment management plan has been lodged with us.
Yeah, no, that's cool, thanks. And to me, that just indicates how much priority Napier City Council is putting towards this issue. The very fact that they've had a number of years to finalise that particular plan, and they've dallied around it, which has been really disappointing. That's not been anything from our point of view, I don't think. I think they've had some challenges across the road.
So that's probably a nice segue to let Anna run through a presentation.
Excuse me. So, firstly, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the flexibility shown in shifting this up the agenda. You'll remember that earlier this year, in about February, we had some breaches of the contact recreational guidelines at Pandora Pond. and we followed up with some monthly sampling. At the time that I came back to the RPC with some results, we were still waiting on our faecal source tracking, and now that we've had that come back in, we thought it would be a good opportunity to round it all off, tell you what we've learned, and actually what we're going to do going forward. So, as a very, very quick introduction, because it sometimes sounds a little bit strange, there are two ways we look at it. One is faecal counts. These let us know if you've breached the contact recreation standards, then we might go into faecal source tracking. And it's actually very simple. We take water samples, the lab plates them, and the numbers determine whether or not we are considered in breach. And all they do is they count the dots on the numbers, and so you can see that this water is relatively clean, 2 coliform forming units per 100 mil. This is a lot greater, and they'd actually have to dilute that down to count it. But from the freshwater, an alert is around 260, and that just prompts us to continue monitoring so that we know whether or not it goes into that red zone, which is where we start to recommend people don't undertake swimming there, or at least the Ministry of Health do. And marine, it's 140 and 280. So just a reminder, we had a couple of exceedances about a week apart and then a couple of days apart, and that was relatively uncommon for Pandora Pond in a non-rainfall related time period. So we needed to figure out what was going on. The pond was considered unsuitable for recreation for a while. I think it was for around a month. And we actually undertook daily sampling under all kinds of different tidal regimes, times of the day, for that month. We also did a sort of whole of catchment approach that we could start to understand maybe where sources of contaminants may be coming from. So we did sampling at the Sailing Club, the West Shore Bridge to determine whether it was coming on an incoming tide, at the Pandora Pond in 2 places where we normally sample, as well as at the inflatable, which was actually taken out during that time. In the Thames Tyne confluence with the estuary, just slightly up, and at the railway bridge to figure out whether anything was coming downstream. So the results were pretty interesting, actually. So you can see this is where we got our 3 exceedances of the recreational guideline, and the different colours correspond to different sites within the estuary. This is at the Pandora Pond, and typically we don't really see that. It'll pop once in a while, particularly if it's been raining, but we haven't sort of seen that kind of pattern before. The Thames Tyne are these red dots, and it always seems slightly higher at the Thames Tyne, or coming out of the Thames Tyne than elsewhere. And then we had a very large rainfall. That was the March event, where we had the Esk Valley flooding system, huge rainfall, and you can see it just pops pretty much everywhere from there on in. And basically the conclusions that we brought to the RPC was, obviously it shows a really strong influence of rainfall, the elevated levels coming from the Thames Tyne, and we did get some faecal source tracking samples out of that. Unfortunately, when you do faecal source tracking, you actually have to collect 5 litres of water at the same time, and it's hugely expensive to do. So we don't undertake it as routine, but we undertake it as a routine if we see persistent problems. And occasionally you'll see very high counts coming in from both the Railway Bridge and the Thames Tyne during those high rainfall events. And this is just the other indicator, which is Entrecocca. It shows a very similar pattern. Right, what did we find? At the time that we actually sampled, there were scums forming on the top of the water near where the inflatable was. They would put a hose out to inflate the inflatable, and these scums would get trapped. So we actually sampled those scums. They weren't hugely high in bacteria, but we sent them through for faecal source tracking, and it did come back as birds, which is fairly expected for a wildlife refuge and a bird area. So the scums present at the inflatable were attributed to birds. The elevated, we did find some elevated counts, which we actually then put through for faecal source tracking coming out of the Thames Tyne, and they were sourced to bovine. So they came back as ruminant, and we asked them to actually drill down a bit more, determine whether these were sheep, but they actually came back as cow. Now, where is that coming from? Obviously, that's the big question. These are some photos. This one here is actually taken at the top of the Ahuriri estuary, and this just shows you the power of the hotspot fund. we actually were able to get in there within a month, work with the farmer and actually fence that area off. And that's because we were able to do it, that fund was there. This is probably a week or so ago now, maybe 2 weeks, and there were a lot of cattle beasts roaming the estuary, which were called in by animal control and sent back onto the railway land adjacent to the estuary. We're still working on where that bovine source is coming from. We have a sample down with the lab in Christchurch from that railway bridge site. Now, if that comes back as positive, it could be that that actually came from downstream and made its way up on an incoming tide. The other sources obviously are meat processing plants within the Thames Tyne catchment itself. So we're working with Napier City on those areas. Where to from here? As I said, the Hotspot Fund has helped us to resolve immediate issues, working with NCC, and we will continue more work during the summer of 2018 and 2019.
Any questions?
Yeah,
Councillor Bailey.
yeah, thank you, Chair. I've had contact from some people in town. You know, their kids are still sick from what happened over summer. They're still suffering from illnesses because of it, which is really sad. In your professional opinion, given the likelihood of rain events during the summer, do you think that Napier City Council should continue to be putting the bouncy castle into Pandora Pond because of the delays from with these things happening?
Wherever you put more people, you're going to get more chance of illness. So wherever we've got popular spots, if they do get fecal contamination, you will get your chance of illness is going to be higher just by the public health rationale of your increased exposure because of increased numbers of people. Look, I can't say it would be a public health question, Ministry of Health. Realistically, it comes down to the fact of, do we have enough evidence to suggest that this has been an ongoing, continual problem? Over the past, I don't think we have. I think it's worth us continuing our testing through this summer, particularly if the inflatable does go back in. We'll probably up the testing in conjunction with Napier City Council. But the difficulty is of course you've got the inflatable going into an area that is natural, so it's unmanageable. You can't chlorinate it.
Yep.
So yeah, that's a risk as well.
So it's a good question, Councillor, and I guess the District Health Board are closely connected to this work as well. So our skills are not public health. We're collecting the information and providing it to authorities to make those sorts of decisions and calls, and doing it as quickly as we can. I think that's something that City Council with Public Health would need to have a hard conversation about, to sort of say, is this sensible, would that make sense? We'll supply them with all the information to help inform those discussions, but ultimately it's a health risk assessment they would need to make.
Yeah, cool. And look, I also appreciate too that there's a challenge that Napier City Council has with putting recreational facilities into basically the bottom end of a wildlife estuary in terms of getting the contamination coming from birds.
Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Don't panic, Councillor Bailey. If they shifted, I'll tell you where it is so you don't miss out. Question though, working with NCC, so what we seem to hear what we're doing at our end all the time, but what's actually happening at that end?
In terms of this particular project?
Yeah, just sort of how far up the food chain are we getting as far as managers, etc. go, and what's their ambition for what does success look like for them just at a staff level?
Just before Anna jumps in there, that's why I was suggesting that I think that's a really good question, and that's kind of that broader conversation to have with them. Where are you going? What are you doing? How seriously are you taking these issues? Beyond the immediacy of this particular incident over the summer, there will be others, and obviously they've got a planned investment and activity there. Well, what does that look like? When's it going to happen? How is it dealing with these issues, or is it related to these issues? That's right up there and very pertinent, and we think that's something that we would like to try and facilitate, is that sort of conversation to get that understanding and commitment.
I mean, their constituents did approve in their long-term plan the more ambitious of the two options that were presented. I mean, one was a large amount of money to be applied against a comprehensive redevelopment, basically, of that whole area. And the other was a narrower focus of $6 million, I think it was, just to be spent on stormwater management. So they certainly have now been given the funding approval to do a substantial amount of work. Whether it's going to materialize, I think that's what we want to, now's the time to have some face-to-face with them. Staff is proposing in a workshop, which I think makes a good idea, is get some of them over here and really have a toe-to-toe about this.
You.
Councillor Curtin.
Well, my line of discussions are similarly focused on the relationship with Napier City. Anna, can you just tell us, in terms of your science outputs and considerations, what engagements do you have with the respective staff from Napier City on these sorts of outcomes?
We do have a good relationship with this at the staff level. Cameron Burton, who is the environmental manager there, and we've been meeting with John Kingsford as well. That was earlier this year. And look, I forward all this information on to them in order to for them to engage in that as well. My hope is that we would work together. Some of these things within the Thames Tyne high entry levels could actually just be naturalised levels that are coming out of the sediments, but there is work to be done to actually determine whether that's the case or not. So I've approached them, and they're pretty happy to work together and try and resolve some of these questions.
Sure. It just possibly, Mr. Chair, goes to where, James, you've talked about, if you like, mapping the respective strategic directions of councils. I just wonder whether we bring back to this table on a regular basis what connections we are having, and so it's really quite focused and strategised that we are saying, well, here is the engagement, and this is where that's where we're heading. It's that relationship management potentially. So we're fully understanding that you are engaging. I'm conscious that there are a number of engagements on a number of occasions across a number of staff, and that's good. But we possibly don't know that. And I just wonder whether there's potential to map it.
So, Councillor, again, a great suggestion, and where I had envisaged all of that would come together was in the catchment plan, the broader catchment plan for the estuary through the committee, for exactly that reason. Who are the actors? What are they doing? What are they trying to achieve? Where are the points of alignment? How do we sequence it? That's all visible, it's all clear, it's all agreed to, and then we're held to task on it. That's an ideal place to put it. Obviously, we just need to get that moving.
And in terms of reporting in, how do you see, can we bring it back? Sorry.
So, look, I was just going to make a suggestion that as the representative of the council on the committee, one possibility is that you suggest to the committee that it provides its report that it will be getting from the range of agencies on all of that activity, and the management plan refers it back to this committee as an information item on a regular basis, and that will obviously cut down on
the duplication.
But I think it's appropriate actually that this council receives a report from the Ahuriri Management Committee.
Sure. I agree.
Happy to move, Chair.
Second.
I'll second that.
Just a comment, I just wanted to acknowledge Anna's fine contribution last Sunday night. It was a great little piece on national TV. So, well done.
And she's also chairing at the moment the New Zealand Marine Society's conference here in Napier with 200 plus delegates, so she's just heading back to that.
I had to get Marine in there somewhere.
Okay, thank you for that report. Let's go back to number 9.
Well, you've got to
receive it.
Move. You've got to move. You've got to move in a second. You have to put the motion to the.
No more speakers. We'll move the accepting of the report. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Granted. Granted? Approved. All right, now, number 9, Tukituki Tranche 2 Groundwater. Is that you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the committee. So, a few weeks ago, there was a flurry of public consternation around Tranche 2 groundwater, so I thought it would be probably an opportune time with this committee meeting coming up just to give you an update really of where we're at with that. I think at the time there was the consternation was around the a misunderstanding that the water was about to be allocated and the implications of that for existing groundwater takes in particular. So this paper really just sets out for you the three things: the background, the current state, and the future steps around the Tranche 2 allocation. So I'm not going to go through it all, but briefly, the background, as you will all be aware, is it was set by the Board of Inquiry, with minus the support of the Regional Council at the time, and who felt, and we still do, that additional allocation is not sustainable. However, people were then entitled to apply for the water, and as you'll see in the paragraph 3, 8 groups have applied for in excess of the total that is available, which is 15 million cubic metres, and the actual application is total applications is for 17.1. But in recognition of the lack of precision in the plan about how the augmentation would work, and indeed whether or not the whole take is sustainable, we've put the consent applications on hold and asked the applicants to provide us with information which they're acquiring through Aqualink, actually on running a numerical model based on where we know that the applications have been made. So no longer theoretical, but actual proposed takes and actual proposed locations. And they'll look at quantifying the stream depletion effects and also looking at potentially the effects, if there are to be any effects further downstream. And the timing for that work's been undertaken now. So we are expecting the work from that modelling back in the next 2 to 3 months. And as I said, the applications are on hold. Now, we've got a duty to actually process those applications, whether or not that's ends up being a straight decline or it may well be consideration of public notification, considering the adverse effects. We won't know that until really we've got the work back from Aqualink, but at this stage, the consent applications are still live, if you like, although on hold, and we will process as everyone has a right to be processed. I think what we are signalling is that at some stage, when there is a review of Plan Change 6, it would be good to have a look at that Tranche 2 provision. But we acknowledge that it's not a high priority at the moment in terms of plan change requirements, but it is something that, as staff, we would signal that there's a close look given to that, as and when the opportunity arrives. So that's it for now. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to take questions.
Councillor Bergman.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Liz. I'm really struggling to get my head around this, I've got to say. So the Board of Inquiry have deemed that there is an extra 15 million cubic metres of water available, so long as an applicant can demonstrate that the surface flows can be sustained or kept up to a particular level.
So long as they can augment, the surface water take, yep.
On the other hand, our view, as I understand it, is that the aquifer is over allocated without that 15 million cubic metres, and that the only way that anybody can take water out of this Tranche 2 allocation is by actually mining the resource as opposed to using it in a sustainable way, if I can explain it in a simpleton's terms, because that's how I understand it.
How would you?
So the allocations are fully met. So it was an allocation of 28.5 million cubes. It's fully allocated, so within the existing limits. The challenge is in essence, the way the Tranche 2 is designed to work, in our view, does create potential for mining of the resource, because the way you would augment it is through the further use of groundwater. So it is quite cyclical, and it was envisaged, as we understand it, to be coupled with storage rather than acting independently. So the challenge is, given the very connected nature of the resource there, that if you take from groundwater to augment the effects of groundwater takes, you're just compounding a problem, and over time you add to a long-term stream depletion.
So you're just using different words to say what I said, which was that you're mining a resource rather than using it in a sustainable way.
Mining's just, it's very emotive. It's absolutely one of the possibilities, because mining means effectively you get rid of the whole lot.
So probably that's how a lot of the people down there, they feel quite emotive about it as well.
So the outcome would be, if you simply added another 15 million cubic metres of allocation to groundwater, let's just pretend that's what you did, and you didn't look to do any augmentation. If you just added that, you won't mine the resource, i.e. it won't disappear. You'll simply add to a long-term chronic stream depletion issue at the outlet of the groundwater. So where the spring flows come in, and where the river pops up before the ranges and flows down the valley, you'll just lessen the amount of water that's appearing there. So your spring flows will be less. They won't disappear. Some of them may, but there will still be water there. It's just you've added to the stream depletion problem.
Their consultant, the group that hired the consultant during the inquiry, simply established to the board's satisfaction that there would not be mining, would not occur. You could take another 15 million without disrupting the equilibrium of the aquifer, and I guess we challenge that as well. But accepting that evidence, then the only consequence to deal with was the surface water impact of doing it. So it wasn't a threat to the stability of the aquifer per se. Right. It was a surface water.
Right. So that leads me to my question, which is, are the criteria by which we are required by the Board of Inquiry to evaluate the application for this water, are they wide enough for us to consider the long-term impact that it might have on the aquifer? Because that goes to the core of this, doesn't it?
Relitigating that point, basically.
Yeah, it does really. I mean, what we've asked the applicants to, if you like, assess or provide us with the information for is around the impacts of their particular takes, but we haven't asked them more broadly to look at the long-term impacts of the aquifer itself.
Right, because isn't that one of the things that we want to consider, or that whichever the hearing is that hears us would want to think about?
Yeah, Council has that power. Right. To effectively the applicants have to avoid, remedy and mitigate their effects, and I think that's broad enough to sort of talk to immediate and long term, and there's sufficient knowledge to understand the long term effects of adding another 15 million cubes of groundwater from the system, and then we could further understand, well, if you were proposing to augment, as Councillor Balfour was saying, the impacts on surface water from more groundwater takes, the effect of that. So it's all viewable and understandable, and then it's up to the applicants to demonstrate how they would manage that.
Weren't we doing our own remodelling exercise?
Not in this current financial year. I think there's been provision made for in years 2 and 3 of the long-term plan for us to do.
There was something already underway to
No, we'll be doing more data collection in our SkyTem, our resource understanding, but the remodelling is in the out years of the LTP.
Do you know offhand who the consultant was who established there was 15 million?
It was Aquilent. So they're using the same folks.
So we're using the same folks? Well,
they are.
Once it comes in, Chair, then what will happen is that the consent staff will then refer to the science staff internally, and we will then critique the work that's come in from Aquilent. And like any resource consent, we could well get ourselves into a situation where we've got 2 different views of science. Consent staff will then need to make a decision about notification, etc. If we go to full notification, then we're going to be off to the hearings committee, and councillors or commissioners will get involved with making determinations around that science. And then in the fullness of time, it might go to the Environment Court and be litigated. So this is kind of where we're off to on this.
Thank you, Chair. My views on the Ruatana for consents, Section 36 charges are pretty well known. Just to help me with that, and what quantum of money do we take in that part of the world as Section 36 charges? First question. I'm happy to take this up offline with
I can't give you that answer off the top.
And the second question, how many other consents in that area are frustrated by, or what are they frustrated by, if any? Are there any consents that have been frustrated by legal challenge, legal change, things outside the control of the applicant? I'd really like to understand what that looks like.
So the answer to that second part is I'm not aware of any, but I will be asking.
The Ruatana for consent is the only one.
The series, there's a suite of consents for Ruatana.
Yeah, the connected consents there are frustrated by the ruling on the Dockland Exchange, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. But there's no others that are frustrated by any other.
Not that I'm aware of, no. But I will double check that, and if I'm wrong, I'll.
What about elsewhere in this region too, for example?
There's a reasonably large number that have not been activated. But in terms of a statutory impediment to uptake, I don't think we're aware of any other one other than the Ruatana for package of consents. So certainly you could construct an argument to say that because they have been frustrated beyond the control of the consent holder, therefore they've got a case for relief from Section 36 charges. I think the counter-argument to that would be if there are statutory impediments to those consents being exercised, they should be surrendered.
The 8 groups that we keep referring to, they're publicly identifiable, are they not?
They are, yes.
I would, for one, would like to see a list of who the 8 groups are. Any other comments?
Happy to move the recommendation, Chair.
I've seconded. Mr. Wilson, thank you. Further comment? All those in favour?
Well, yeah,
go ahead.
This is an extremely frustrating exercise, and it's indicative of some of the crazy decisions that came out of the Board of Inquiry. It's left us in a most awkward position because we're looking to grant consents where we argued against that particular issue at the Board of Inquiry. It's a bit of a circular argument, but we need to break the circle somehow. I would be, I don't know. It'll be interesting to see where it ends up. Anyway.
Any other comments? All those in favour?
Aye.
Aye. Approved? Okay. Tukituki plan implementation update.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While Madeline's coming up to the front to present, apologies for leaving off an attachment off the paper around the communications. I've just put a hard copy of that in front of each of you so you can see the suite of communications that's been undertaken by the Regional Council in the last 4 years. Anyway, I'd like to introduce you to Madeline Hall. I don't know that Madeline's actually presented to a committee before, but she is the author of this paper and has had extensive input into the findings that she's about to present to you. Madeline, I've got her title down there as a Senior Land Management Advisor, but as of Monday she will have another grand title which she can explain to you, and we've got a very brief presentation which is really a summary of the paper, and then of course again happy to take questions. Thank you.
Great. So good morning, members. As Liz said, my name is Madeline Hall, and as of Monday I am a Senior Catchment Advisor Central.
Oh, good grief.
But on Sunday I had an even longer title, which was Senior Catchment Advisor Implementation. So if that's not a mouthful, but What effectively that meant is that I was working with other members of the land management team to implement Tukituki Plan Change 6, and specifically the infamous farm plans. So this paper gives you a bit of an update on 2 deadlines that have recently passed.
So I'm sorry, does that title, Central, mean that you're one of the vaunted 16 emissaries to the farming world?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
in the central zone.
In the
with
central
3
zone,
zones.
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm around here. So, as we're all aware, a farm plan is essentially a regulatory requirement in order to continue permitted activities in the Tukituki catchment region. And I'm conscious that it can be very confusing as to who has to do what. I tend to think of it as people can fall into one of 5 categories. So these are people who either, 1, don't have to do anything, so they're not eligible under the plan. Either they don't have a productive land use, or the land that they do have is under 4 hectares. Then there are those between 4 and 10 who may be considered to be low intensity. Then you have folks between 4 and 4,000 hectares, depending on the size, that are required to have a farm plan done by May 31st. Then you have those who, by May 31st, had a farm plan that was in progress. And then we have those who we haven't yet heard from, and our compliance team is checking in on those. So, effectively, this May 31st deadline has been an accumulation of work for the land management team to date. And I am kind of the reflection of many, many members of the team who have been working consistently on this since October 2015 when the plan became operative. And it's surprisingly a success, actually. It's been really great to see. So you can see some numbers. I know you guys like numbers. And we've had over 1,000 farm plans or low-intensity forms completed or in progress as of a couple of days ago, which is really, really fantastic, and a really high rate of compliance with these obligations.
Can I just interrupt and ask a question? So, in our minutes earlier today from the previous ENS meeting, which was in April, it reported at that time on the number of farm plans that have been submitted, which was 237, I think. So since April to now, it's gone from 237 to 1,007. So that's, I don't know, 700 and something.
Yeah.
Loads and loads of external professionals have been approved to do those plans. I have no idea how we've managed to ramp up our internal resources to handle the same number, and I don't believe for a moment that we could have adequately done that. So I'm interested in your view on that.
Yeah. So this goes really well to the transition of kind of highlighting the number of FEMPs that have been completed over time. And you'll see some wonderful bumps at the end of the financial years when we were providing financial support for early adoption of farm plans. And then you see a nice giant ramp up coming into that May 31st deadline. And throughout this period, we've had one of my colleagues working quite hard on approving a number of these farm plan providers. So at the moment we have 22 of those individuals, which is really a
On our staff?
No. So these are all external rural professionals who we have been working with to train and answer any questions that they may have. So we are essentially giving a soft guarantee to landowners that if they work with one of our approved providers, that there's a much higher likelihood of a farm plan being completed by them to then meet our Schedule 22 requirements. Because Schedule 22 is a bit of a boggle.
So, Councillor, what hasn't happened is that all of those plans coming in have been reviewed by staff, because that's not practical. So we've had this effectively accredited provider program to say, if you come in through an accredited provider, we'll accept that that's up to standard and we won't check it. Just to draft out those we don't need to spend time on at the moment. If you're not an accredited provider or come through a non-accredited provider, we have to look in more detail. And we also have an audit program to say we'll check some of those plans coming in through an accredited provider to ensure they're meeting our standards. So it's very similar to the way we've done water meters.
So that's really important to understand. So what you're saying is, if the plan was done by an accredited provider, of whom there are 22, we're not even looking at them. We're not vetting them. We're not auditing them. We're not doing anything with them.
No, so
we're
we're
just
not-
accepting
no.
that they're up to scratch.
So we're not checking all of them.
Yeah.
We're not scrutinising all of them, but we will be auditing some of them. So it's very similar. In fact, it's identical to the way we did the water metering installation program, where it was impossible for us to go and physically check every installation, and we had accredited providers who met our standards, who, if they provided us a form that said, we've done this according to your standards, we accepted that as an installation and ticked it off, but we went back and audited a random sample of those to make sure that they were up to scratch, and if they weren't, well, we would then go in and look at much greater detail in those that were done by somebody who failed audit.
Okay, so of the plans that were submitted to us that weren't done by those 22 accredited providers, how many were there?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. Shane may be able to answer that. But we've tried to set up the system where we can kind of keep track. So what we ask our approved providers to do is give us a bit of the summary of the components of the farm plan, and in order to submit that summary, they have to have a pull-down list, and their name is on it. So if their name is not on that list, then we've had to go with them individually to say, yep, we'll add you on, but we're kind of keeping track of your activities.
And so Shane, who Madeline referred to, is actually Shane Gilmer, who was working in our water quality team, and he's now the Farm Environment Management Plan Coordinator. So his full-time role as of the new financial year is on Farm Environment Management Plan. So over the course of, well, obviously right now he's busy still trying to keep a hold of the database and making sure that doesn't get away on us. But he's also going to be running an audit program over the next 2 years, and obviously that will lead towards the information that we will need to determine, whether or not we're going to need to look at the LUCs and make all the changes that may be required in catchments that are over the DIN limit. So he's going to start an audit program working towards that. So we haven't had a chance to physically read, check, inspect every single FEMP that's come through the wires, but we are going to be running quite a managed program of audits over the next 2 years.
So just in percentage terms, 10% of them? 20% of them?
From non-approved providers?
No, from approved.
From approved?
Oh, the absolute majority would be from
nearly
approved.
all of them will be from...
Oh, you'll check nearly all of the...
No,
Oh, sorry.
He's asking what proportion of the approved providers we will audit. I can't remember what the percentage is. We have agreed a proportion in our audit program. I'll have to come back to you on what that figure is.
I'm interested to know.
Yep.
Okay. Sorry, Madeline, I
interrupted
your flow.
I'm sure it'll be
No, that's
statistically
fine.
significant.
Absolutely. R squared of 0.9.
Yeah. So this graph is just a summary of the FEMPs that we've received notification of. We also have a huge swath of those that are in progress, as well as low intensity forms. So one of the really exciting things is that since 1 January this year, between then and June 1st, there was a 4-fold increase in low intensity forms completed. And that's the direct result of some team focus and engagement on folks who we may not have been working with too intently prior to this time. So here is a wonderful map of the coverage of FEMPs that we have received notification of to date. Those in green are completed, and those in orange are our estimates of in progress. And the grey areas are either areas that are non-eligible or that we haven't received notification of a farm plan done just yet. And so some of those areas we will definitely be following up on. This map is really a reflection of the substantial amount of work done within as well as outside council with a number of our communities, especially those in priority subcatchments, as well as with industry groups such as Beef and Lamb New Zealand, who we've been working closely with to support the uptake and creation of farm plans for their levy payers that are at a lower cost and can be done in a workshop setting. We've also been working with wine growers and forestry managers and low intensity or small block lifestyle blockers as well, just to make sure that they understand their obligations and can get a farm plan done as easily and quickly as possible.
So on the left-hand side of
Yep.
that is a huge area.
Yes.
I presume that's state forest.
It's
or something.
stockland, and also I think, you know, probably ideally we should colour that differently, and also the urban areas of Waipukurau and Waipawa kind of stand out as well.
Hidden in there as well, that would be
And
Yeah.
yeah, so this was just sort of to give ourselves really a bit of a sense of the areas covered. Yeah.
So I think it results in there being around 200 who are missing in action.
About 180, yeah.
Yeah.
Are they significant players? Are they little guys? You know, can you characterize who that is?
I think it's fair to say that there's a mix of little players, and I know that there's one who's you know, potentially hundreds of hectares that hasn't begun a farm environment management plan yet. So there is a bit of a range of those. When we sent out a letter about 2 to 3 weeks ago, we actually sent it out to over 300 who we hadn't heard from. So we've had a pretty good response rate back from those people to get it down to 180. We're going to send out one more letter, and that's only because, or asking for what their intended action is, only because we're aware that this time of year there may be some people, you know, away and they may not have had a chance to even see their mail. We only gave them a week and a half to respond to us. So, but after that we will be looking at formal enforcement action.
And as part of the work of the land management team, we worked to prioritise how we were going to get these done, because at the beginning of us all, it was a question of how do we make this happen? How do we felt that we couldn't do it on our own, so how do we create a market for farm plans, and how do we train people to do those things, and who do we focus on and why? So the decision was made to focus on those residing and operating within the priority subcatchments, as well as the larger properties, and making sure that they had the support that they needed.
So I would think that if I were Hugh Ritchie and spent whatever he spent, 10, 15 grand to do his farm environmental plan, that he'd be really pissed off if his next door neighbor who was farming 200 or 300 hectares had no plan. And so to me, it's one thing if it's you know, a lifestyle block that just needs to do a perfunctory whatever, and it's another thing if it's a major league farmer who has a ideological bug up their butt or some problem with this program, not being publicly identified as a recalcitrant. We've gone through this for 3 years now, so they could be on vacation for the last 2 weeks of that 3 years, I guess, and missed the letter. But at some point, you know, I've had you, Richie, complain that we were even subsidizing, you know, people to do these plans because, you know, we said, well, wait, a lot of us just did it and accepted the cost of doing it and got over it. And what you'll hear from some of these folks is that meanwhile, you know, Steve down the road here hasn't even done his plan. And it really irritates some of these folks, to say nothing of the public perception of it. When we get to this stage, I think we do need to consider, you know, who, you know, making some examples.
So perhaps I'll make some comment on that. Look, we'll take an equitable approach across the board. So possibly rather than making examples, which is a legitimate way of communicating to the broader public regulatory expectations, where we've got a few individuals who are not playing by the rules, and we want to send some broader messaging. In this case, we could be looking at 100 or more non-compliant landowners. So I think it is important that we treat all of those equitably. The plan at this stage, following the letter that Liz referred to, will be issuing an infringement notice. So that's a fine. And if there's not action taken after that or the fine is not paid, then we move to prosecution. And prosecution is a public process where people have their day in court. In the first instance, they get the opportunity to seek names suppression prior to the court outcome. But I wouldn't anticipate that being granted easily by the courts. And so therefore those people will be in the public domain. So we could be in a situation where we've got dozens of prosecutions we're taking in this regard.
Are infringement notices themselves a public action?
Our practice to date is to not name parties until we've had a successful prosecution through the courts. We typically don't publicise the parties when we issue an infringement notice. I'd need to take advice as to whether or not there's any particular reason why we couldn't. I don't know, Liz, whether you want to...
No, I just wanted to clarify that actually what the action that we probably would be looking to take is probably an abatement notice rather than an infringement notice, and the reason for that is we would be requiring them then to take action to get a resource consent, because in fact what they're in breach of now is the plan, and so they're no longer a permitted activity. So the next step is to require them to get a resource consent. And what we have said in the letter is that the first thing you're going to be required to do as part of your resource consent is to get a FEMP. So save yourself the money and the hassle and go and get your FEMP. So I think so the tenor of our letter, the next letter, will be that we will be issuing you with an abatement notice unless we hear from you by blah blah.
So I don't want to...
And then potentially a prosecution.
Beat a dead horse here, but you know, the same situation has been brought to me by Peter Kay, who, you know, apparently everybody up in his subcatchment knows that there's a particular person who's engaging in seriously flawed farming practices, has brought it to our attention apparently at the council or to somebody appropriate at the council on a number of occasions, and nothing has been done. And so my concern is that you have some of the most progressive, prominent people in the farming world in Hawke's Bay will do the right thing, will take leadership on these issues, and then feel that we are not cracking the whip when we need to be cracking the whip. And I'm just going to put that on the table and invite those folks to come forward with those complaints. And I think we need to be cognizant of what the effect that is of the overall sort of morale, if you will, as we're trying to cross over all these catchments and tell people to do more and require more of them, that we need to be ready to come down on folks who are non-compliant with these, because it really bothers the folks who are trying to push everybody in the right direction.
And I think you can, Councillor, you can be, I'll attempt to reassure you that we do have an enforcement strategy that we've worked through before the 31st of May deadline, so that we're quite clear on how we are going to ensure compliance with the plan requirements. We're very aware that this is not only the first catchment in Hawke's Bay with this requirement, it's one of the first in New Zealand. So there will be an element of people looking to see how this goes, how seriously we take it, and you know, whether or not council actually means business on this. And the messages that we do, we are taking the steps, I wouldn't say cautiously, but perhaps precautiously, to ensure that we do everything in a fair but timely way, and then the ultimate is going to be a prosecution. And we've already signalled that to people.
Thank you, Chair. Through you to Liz, I suppose. So at the end of the day, I mean, if we're going down the path of things that we can do, we ultimately end up saying to people they need to have a resource consent, and that allows us to take a prosecution over them if they're operating without a resource consent, which is where we are with, say, for tomato mushrooms, or where we got to with tomato mushrooms, right? Yeah. So at the end of the day, if they don't, if we get a court order that complies them to do, is the court able to say to someone, well, you're not willing to play the game, therefore you cannot operate as your business on that particular property? So ultimately, can the court turn around and say that you can no longer farm on your land if they so desire?
No, I mean, it is an option.
Yep, absolutely. And look, taking away the right for people to farm is something that's been done for animal welfare reasons more recently. So there's certainly precedent for that. It would be the last resort, of course.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. But at the end of the day, that's the ultimate.
It is the ultimate sanction.
Ultimately, that's the ultimate sanction. So I think the property owners down there, because I'm with Tom on this one. There's 1,000 landowners down there that have done the right thing, and I want to congratulate them for doing that, because that's the way forward. But there are a couple of hundred, or just under a couple of hundred, that give us the middle finger. And I don't care if they have been on holiday for 2 weeks. They've had 2.5, 3 years to get this done. And at the end of the day, they need to be aware of what the ultimate consequence of them dallying around with this on us. And at the end, it could mean that they are no longer able to farm on their property. So their business and their livelihood is at stake in this, as much as the river, the ecological health of the river is. So I just wanted to point that one out. I mean, like you say, it's unlikely to happen, but it is potential.
What's the average cost of a FEMP?
It depends. So
I'm the politician. I'll do the diffusion here.
Yeah. So it really it can depend on the provider. So different providers charge different rates. Some of them base it on the quantum of hours that they have to be spending on a given farm plan. Others do it based on the size of the property. So it can depend. And we've also provided a bit of support up to $1,000 over covering the cost of a farm plan for those who are getting on board early.
Is there a range?
There is a range.
Yeah, so there's a range between 750 to 15,000. Is kind of.
I'd say $5,000. Would that be? I'm just thinking 1,000 already. That's times 5,000 is $5 million. I mean, it's not chump change, is it? That's what's been spent so far.
Yeah.
Say. Okay.
The highest cost relates to the cropping properties that have multiple land use happening and a high degree of complexity and a lot of nutrient modelling and budgeting that need to be done for those properties. If you're a single use, let's say sheep and beef farm, and you've got a relatively uniform land use capability type, then it's pretty straightforward.
And would it also be fair to say, sorry, Chair, through you, would it also be fair to say that because there are a number of different FEMP providers out there, there is essentially a competitive market, so pricing is dependent on what the market is prepared to accept. So, that's life, We live in the neoliberal environment, so they can put up with it.
That's why we've encouraged as many accredited providers in as we could. And absolutely right, Councillor, that there's a lot of money being spent on there. The real money's yet to be spent, though. This is just getting the plans written. Then implementing them is another whole story. Significant on-farm costs associated with that, potentially.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep. So just a couple of more points before I continue on to the next slide. So this kind of coverage is really a reflection of some awesome work done by our communications team as well, and you'll see an appendix just kind of summarizing some of the publications that we've done over time. And also just as part of this, turning policy into practice can always be a bit of a challenge. So the land management team has also been working on that, both providing advice to landowners and what exactly is included within a farm plan, what is the obligations under Schedule 22, and also somewhat important things that may seem silly, like the definition of stock, that need to be defined as part of the implementation of this. So this is just a quick heads up that we've also had another regulatory deadline pass as of July 1st, and Liz is going to be able to better cover this off. I personally haven't been working with this to date, but essentially there's new minimum flow requirements that reduces the security of supply of water for those who already have consented takes. And from my understanding, there's been some research put in to support these people moving forward. So what happens now? We're essentially shifting from a here to help message to a here to check. And this is a kind of shift in the workload from mostly sitting within the land management team to kind of shifting across council and more sitting within the consents and compliance team. So we're going to be working with our teams on that in an integrated way to make sure that we all have a good understanding of the situation. There's also more obligations for us as a council to fulfill. So we still need to be providing some procedural guidelines, and I can give you a bit of an update on what those may include. As Ian was mentioning, we still need to be auditing these farm plans to make sure that they're up to scratch, and we're developing a program of work around that. And the next deadline is May 2020, which is really when the hard work starts, where stock have to be excluded from waterways and where the farm plans need to be implemented by. And as Ian was saying, this is the hard part of the journey. Really, a farm plan is the first step. And moving forward, we have our integrated catchment management staff who are dedicated to that southern area of the catchment, who will be working with landowners in those areas to help them implement their farm plans, and hopefully with some resources to do that. And in addition to that, we have 2 new members here in the Napier office who, as Liz mentioned, will be helping to coordinate our FEMP process, both in Tukituki and in any other catchments that are coming down the line, and to make sure that we have a coordinated effort across council, which is the principal advisor policy implementation, which is making sure that we're getting all the pieces together and getting them across the line.
And those 2 new roles are both being filled by existing staff members, so they're straight onto the job, which is great. So Shane, who I referred to earlier, is the FEMP coordinator, and Louise McPhail, the principal advisor policy implementation, who's currently working in the consents section. That's it in terms of the presentation. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'd just like to make a comment and thank the staff that have worked on this. They've done a fantastic job to get the number over the line that they have. And like I said, those landowners that have got them over the line, I'd like to thank them as well. Because I know, you've had some challenges. We've had some challenges down in Central Hawke's Bay, but I think this is an indication of where the community down there is now going. They're taking it in a much more positive light. So I'm really pleased with it. Like I say, the staff, just from the communications right down to the people on the ground, it's all been great. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. So this has been a bit of a harrowing journey, really, this whole business of chasing FEMPs, and it's really only just beginning in one sense, because we now have the auditing and the implementation phase to come, and it's highly likely that this or something similar to this is going to be rolled out across all of our catchments. So are there any learnings that you've gleaned from what's happened over the past 2 or 3 years that might be of some use to us looking forward?
Plenty, absolutely plenty. Yeah, so the team is kind of gathering our thoughts right now and hoping to share those with other members of council, as well as just our own teammates for those who are going into that catchment for the first time potentially. Yeah, and it's been really fascinating to see, and we've really taken the approach of just kind of learning as we go and taking on board any lessons learned and implementing those quite quickly.
Right, so are there any of those things that might need to be incorporated into the plan itself or the plan change?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So a couple of points just to add to that, and Liz will probably have some as well. Two things. One is that Hawke's Bay's not unique in the challenge, so nationally the sector's involved in these very discussions. How do we get this right? And look, we already have a pretty good idea of some of the fixes we would have liked to have made to Plan Change 6. Tweaks that we were unable to get through and get agreement on proceeding with. But fair to say there will be a growing list coming out of the more recent learning that will come back to at some point in time to say, here are the things we want to fix with urgency. And also that'll feed into TANC and any other regulatory process so that we're taking the learnings and applying them to new policy.
And one example would be like the very basic wording. The farmers are not required to provide us with their FEM. under Plan Change 6. They just have to have one. So things like that we'd like to see, addressed in any future plan change for that area or any new plan changes for other parts of the region. So that's a very basic example. But there's a lot of other things as well. We're looking at, obviously you would have heard of IRIS, which is a new database that we're in the process of implementing, and so it's taking the current FEMPs that we've got and working out what information should we store in there, and so therefore what should we be asking for the tank farm plans, for example. So things like that. Yeah.
Can I just add that I think what this experience demonstrates, both for this council and for regional councils nationally, is what the future looks like if you go forward, say, 10 years. And I think what that does look like is that all regional councils will have a very large body of their work, and it may even be the majority of their work, based around the development of farm plans, the review of farm plans periodically, a whole body of compliance and enforcement work around ensuring that those plans are implemented on an ongoing basis, a whole body of work around the funding mechanisms, as we talked about earlier, to assist the transition and the implementation of those farm plans, and then a whole body of science work to measure the impact and outcomes in stream and on land and what have you. This is such a quantum shift in resourcing and effort from a very, very light touch sort of look around the edges of land use that regional councils have historically done up to this point. Because I think we're going to see this exercise now replicated right across all of the major catchments in the region, and then an ongoing body of work, as far as you can see into the future around it. It's going to be massive, it's going to be really expensive, but this is the reality of a public expectation that land use be regulated henceforth, and a whole body of work be undertaken on farms to meet environmental requirements, and that there be assurance that all that work is being done, and that there are sanctions in place for those that don't. And so it is it is a big shift, and will occupy this committee and this council considerably, I think, in the years ahead.
So I hear what you're saying, but I'd love to think that we might change our view of this to catchment or sub-catchment as they've been discussing at tank, rather than individual plans, because you just get lost in the detail otherwise.
Well, absolutely. I think this has been over-engineered. It wasn't as targeted as the council sought in its original development of Plan Change 6. So there's been a lot of effort put into to farm plans or and certainly the low intensity forms, where you'd have to say that there was a degree of resource applied and effort both by the landowners and the council, which is relatively low priority in terms of the water quality outcomes that we're seeking. So we will be more targeted, but saying that, still I think there is going to be a massive amount of work in the years ahead, even through a more targeted approach as we roll this out.
Yeah, because I think the reality is that this was a very broad brush approach to capture everybody that has perverse outcomes, and there's a better way of doing business, and we're getting our heads around that, and that'll come. But nothing will change the need to document at an individual property scale what you need to do, and then take action on that. Whether you do that as a collective or individually, you might be able to bleed some costs out of that upfront planning, but the delivery on farm will remain.
So, for instance, even what's being contemplated for tank, which is at sub-catchment level, is still going to require farmers to go back and produce individual plans in support of a catchment. Or
certainly agreed actions under that sub-catchment plan for their individual property, and there'll need to be compliance and follow-up on all of that. Yeah.
So making this targeting really concrete, I'm a lifestyle block owner of 35 hectares in the central zone, and so you'll be thrilled to know that you are my senior catchment advisor. If I were to call you Monday morning and say, I've just logged 25 hectares and I have to plant before the end of August, would you feel capable of telling me what my environmental control plan, whether I need one, what I should be planting and so forth?
So this is with regards to your obligations under the National Environmental Standards for plantation forestry then?
Well, I don't know what rules I need to, I'm just
Yeah.
an innocent little farmer out there.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for my catchment
Yeah,
advisor
exactly.
to tell me what should I plant on my 25 hectares. Can you tell me that?
Yeah, so we in the land management team have a wide variety of skills, and our approach to date has been to receive calls, get a bit of context, and then pass them on to the relevant expert within the team. And as we go into our integrated catchment management framework, we're going to need to be doing a bit of rejig about what base level of understanding will every single catchment advisor need to be having, and then who will be those experts, and how will we be sharing that workload across the region.
And so, Council, what you'll find is that, yes, maybe Madeline is your go-to person, and in time, what we'd like to know, like for you as a service, is that anything regional council, your first point of connection is Madeline. She would be able to advise you directly if she had the requisite skills, or if not, she'd say, good question, Tom, I'll bring someone back with me very shortly to help address that issue or resolve that.
So for the crew of 16, an appropriate use of that $350,000 partnership fund, et cetera, could be that we commission Hawke's Bay Forestry Association or someone to upskill our 16 people in forestry-related issues, requirements, tree planting regimes, et cetera, et cetera?
Absolutely, but what I'd probably do first is go to the new MPI enhanced AGS and say there's a partnership fund in there that allows me to get access to skills and labour, and I'll try and get the funding out of the Crown first to pay for that. But either way, yes, it's where we see the skill shortage and the need, we'll look to fill that. And it'll either be filled internally if we've got it, or if the needs be, we'll bridge it through external support until we've got it internally. Ultimately, in time, we want it internally so that we've got that mix of skills to do the job, but we're not naive to think we can just turn a key and make that happen very quickly. We'll go outside the building where we need to get that support.
So
Happy to move.
you cannot move. We are now lacking a quorum, so we are now, I will bring this pleasant conversation to an end on this agenda item, and we will now move to a pleasant discussion of agenda item
Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
11.
What was your
Thank
title
you.
again, Madeline?
What week is it? What day is it?
Yes, exactly. Depends on the day.
She was the provider of bread, sausages wrapped in bread on Saturday morning. I know
We'll come up with some really good acronyms in time to make it easy. So I think the next item is
Whitebait.
Andy's Whitebait paper. And just while Andy's coming up and getting set up, so it will be an interesting discussion, and Andy and I have been exchanging emails recently just around the paper. And a couple of points that I wanted to make from my perspective just to help in the discussion, and I guess my prejudices as a early career fishery manager and understanding the kind of implications of some of the things that you might wish for. The few key points for me, one is we need to be really clear here that Department of Conservation are the fishery manager, not the Hawke's Bay Regional Council. So they have an obligation around species. The Regional Council has an obligation around habitat. The two are very closely connected, and it's important that we work together, and we do, and you'll hear more about that from Andy. We also need to be realistic in what we do and where we pitch our science effort here, because fishery science is incredibly expensive and very long term, and can or is challenged through having highly mobile species that traverse many environments, and separating out the effects of any particular part or any particular stage in their life history is very, very difficult. So we just have to be realistic about what it is that we're looking to achieve, or what we're doing and what it will tell us. And I think Andy and I share a view around that, so that's good. The other point, just final point for me, is the paper does suggest we're coming back to you for more money, and I'm telling you we won't be. That will actually come from within our existing budgets. I think we can fit it within our existing budgets, so don't fear, this isn't about more money.
Ian, before we move on, Regional Council issues stand permits though, don't we?
Yes, we do, but we're not the fishery manager, so we don't set a quota.
Appreciate that, but
all of
our
those
role
controls.
is not just simply habitat manager. We do other things.
We control the access, but not access to the fishery.
Do we monitor, control, or have any obligations, commitments to what happens on those stands, who fishes what?
So Andy's going to talk to that, because one of the propositions is monitoring of their effort and their catch rates, if you like,
Sure.
to give us an indication of success or otherwise in our habitat efforts. All I'm counselling you on is that having had lots of blood noses on this issue through managing the topal fishery, is it's difficult to use catch rates to tell you too much about your efforts elsewhere in the system. So we just need to be realistic that it'll give us a good sense of the direction of travel, but we don't want to be too clever in thinking that we've cracked it, in terms of absolutely describing what's going on here. So, but look, Andy will run you through a presentation and happy to take questions. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks, Ian. So yeah, Whitebait, I presented on this, it was probably a couple of ENSs ago. Since then, we've had another meeting. I think we got a sort of a stronger steer on maybe what you guys wanted to see between then and now. So we've tried to come back with a bit of a, take two. Peter attended that meeting and Doc attended it, and we had a couple of external contractors as well. That's all spelled out in the paper. Today I just thought I'd go through a few of the highlights and show a few more photos, so it's a little bit more illustrative rather than the words. But most of the details are in the paper. I won't go through most of them today. So just a reminder, when people think whitebait, they usually stop at the stage that's in the whitebait paddy, but they do go on and grow into different looking things, and there are 5 different species. I didn't talk about smelt last time, and I still don't think it's the major thing, but I've been told in Hawke's Bay it's quite an important component of the local whitebait fishery.
I'll talk to that later.
And you'll talk to that later. And I'm, but anyway, some people turn their noses down at smelt or up, whatever. It's all good. Smelt is in the mix, certainly, and a lot of people have told me that in Hawke's Bay, so smelt is there now. So yeah, just a reminder, and what Ian was talking about, these, fish are complicated to begin with, but when you've got these fish that have a very complicated life history, it's quite a challenge to understand and predict what's going to happen to them when you do different things. So in this case, the adults live in rivers. So at the top of the page, I'll turn around for this so you can still hear me if I'm talking like that. So the adults, live up in the fresh water. They reproduce. The different ones reproduce in different parts, but they all drift out to sea for the most part. They spend 3 to 6 months there, and then they come back into the rivers, and that's when they're being targeted. Then they need to get back into this habitat and grow. And so I'm going to go through a series of slides here, but just to reiterate, our focus is the habitat that the adult stages, the juveniles and adult stages are using, and then also the habitat they need to spawn in. And I think there's some really good opportunities for council to get involved, and we're already getting involved. But so the fishery itself need to be quite clear that's DOC's responsibility. We don't want to step on anyone's toes or do someone else's job for them. That's most certainly not our job. And there's stuff that can influence the populations that occur at that stage, which will influence the overall pattern of things. But that stays there. But then when we get into the adult habitat, in terms of a fishery, I like to think of this as egg production. So essentially, all of what's going on here is females are producing eggs, and there's different things which influence how many eggs they're going to produce. And 2 areas that council have a huge opportunity in and responsibility is the barriers to migration. So currently, there are things that stop fish from accessing suitable habitat to grow and then later reproduce. So there's a responsibility there. And then you've also got the adult habitat quality. So a lot of the work that's already been planned, planting trees, trying to stop oxygen levels from dropping really low, trying to keep temperatures a little bit more temperate, less hot. All of these things will improve the quality of habitat that those fish are using to produce more eggs. And I'll come back to a target. And if you think about the egg production, this is a very loose estimate and it needs to be revised, but I'm thinking trying to multiply that by 5 is not out of the realms of possibility, and I'll explain that a little bit further. And there's different reasons for that. So you end up opening up new habitat, and then you improve the quality of habitat that's there. And so both of those things result in the females being able to produce more eggs. And then you've also got egg survival, which is also under a lot of our influence. So the quality of habitat that the fish have access to spawn. And again, if you think about this as being egg production, egg survival, if we think about trying to double the current egg survival, that's quite an ambitious target, but it's something that helps illustrate the potential that council do have in affecting this system. And then you've got what goes on out in the ocean, and this is where these group of fishes is really tricky, because there's a lot that goes on out there which is completely outside of our control, and it's it's got a huge influence on the numbers of fish that are going to come back. So I'll show a plot later on which will highlight that. But again, there's a large area of these guys' life history which we don't have much control over, so we don't need to worry about that too much. We just need to focus on the habitat. But if you put those two numbers together, then that's where I've got the 10 times current return migration. This is an ambitious, more of an aspirational target, but just thinking along those lines, I think helps to justify and get people enthusiastic about a lot of the work that council's already proposing to do, because that could be in 50 years' time. That would be a fantastic outcome for the region. So yeah, 10 times whitebait. Really, am I being a bit out of touch with reality here? So this first plot is just showing the. So this is the number of eggs that a female will produce, and this is the size of that female. This plot I've had to extrapolate it, but there's data down here and there's data up here. Usually that's the kind of relationship you get. It might be linear, it might be, a slightly different curve, but the point is that a bigger fish will produce a lot more eggs. And the way that you get bigger fish is by giving them better quality habitat to grow up in. And so in this case, there's 625 eggs there, 1,606 eggs there, so 2.5 times the eggs. These numbers aren't real. They're not real, yeah. So this is it's hypothetical illustration. It's not, these aren't things that you should write down and then expect us to come back with and show you. This is just
the actual examples are hypothetical, or they're real ones?
So that dot there.
No, I'm talking about the two ones you've got.
Oh no, that's hypothetical. So I'll pull that off this plot. This number down here is real. It's about 57 eggs, I think. That number up there is real, and it was 13,000 eggs or something. I've got those examples. So between this big fish and this small fish, there'll be a number of different examples. I've actually got a friend who did this for his thesis, but I haven't been able to get the data off him in time. So this will be one thing that I do in the next year.
And it could be different for different species too?
Could be different for, most certainly. So Inanga, this is based on Inanga. So the most, at the moment we expect that the bulk of the whitebait are coming from Inanga. In the past that may not have been so. And banded cockapoo, they're more likely, like this part of the plot for them is more likely to be 15 to 20,000. They're a bigger fish, and they also probably reproduce multiple times. These guys tend to only spawn once and then die. So as we get into the broader fishery, and particularly when we start to get into the headwater catchments, the hillier stuff where we are going to do a lot of tree planting, that's where we've probably lost a lot of these species that currently don't contribute much to the whitebait fishery. And that side of the equation can really bump up egg production a great deal. But I didn't want to go there just because, this is already fairly hypothetical. We could get extremely hypothetical by going into that territory. And there's a lot of data limitation. But the point here is trying to create a habitat which will foster bigger fish will mean more eggs are being produced. Each one of those eggs can go on and turn into a whitebait. And so that's a nice thing to have in the back of our mind. Habitat quality will make more eggs. And so similar but different idea. So this is that's the Napier watershed. That's the typo stream, the blue line there. And then this is the urban waterways that flow through the bulk of Napier. The colour scheme, this has open access to the estuary, so fish can move up and down this blue line very easily. Over here you've got tide gates, those yellow things there, which restrict access at least some of the time to the orange part of the network. And then these PSs are pumping stations, so they're really hard for fish to get past. And so these red lines, they're areas where you won't be getting any inanga. And so this part of the network can't be producing eggs because there's no fish getting there. This will be one of the more extreme examples, obviously because it's an urban area and highly modified waterways. But if you look at how much waterway there is there, compare that to there, this is where we're going to try to start opening up more habitat. When you do that, you've got more area for fish to produce eggs. So again, that helps us with that equation. These black dots, so this is over about 100 metres, about 100 fish per 100 metres in each of these black dots, and 50 odd there. So you can start to just multiply that up in your head, and we can try and do that next year to actually get more quantitative estimates on what might happen here or there or whatnot to help prioritise where the fish barrier work should go ahead. But again, that in terms of egg production, habitat quality, and then opening up access to new habitat, two things that will really help us there. And then this is just a paper. I'll go through these plots, but now we're talking about egg survival in those spawning areas. So you've got this is different types of habitat. Funnily enough, the best habitat for inanga spawning seems to be those introduced pasture grasses. So you want a really high stem density. So when you look down there, there's lots of little stems and roots. You don't want things like trees that shade out those plants which will produce a higher root density at the surface. You want stuff that keeps it nice and an environment which is really humid. So it keeps the eggs protected and it also keeps them moist. And the root mats of grasses is perfect for that. So this is just the stem density, so the type of habitat. Native plants often don't provide a very high stem density, so that you get into this question of native versus exotic. But if you just look at the type of habitat, you see egg survival here is down at 20%, egg survival over here is up around 40%. So by moving the system from here to there, you're doubling the egg survival rate. And then over here you've got the grazed versus ungrazed pasture. So the grazed versus ungrazed spawning area. The number of eggs that you get when you've stopped getting access is 10 times as many, and the survival of this number of eggs is 3 times as many when it's not being grazed. So there's actually again, that's a multiplying effect there. Paul?
It's huge.
It is, yeah. And so I don't want people to focus on the details here, really just the principles. So there's some things that we can do to really increase the number of eggs and also increase the survival of those eggs. And that's in our turf, that's our territory, looking after the habitat. So that's why I think this aspirational target of 10 times is probably something to, think about. I don't think it's something to expect very precisely, but it's just it's a nice sort of concept. Let's try to increase whitebait numbers by 10 times as many through the habitat improvements that we're going to be able to achieve. And we're already on track to achieving with the long-term plan proposal. So that's that. And then there's a few short-term actions. So I outlined more of these in detail in the paper, but we've had a bunch of reports written over the years, and they go out, they've identified where the spawning habitat is, and then they've said, hey, look, you want to do this to improve that habitat. This is an example that's a little bit counterintuitive. So they spawn on this bank here. This is in just near the Grange Creek in the Tuki, so the lower Tukituki River. And this is actually the kind of stuff that the fish eggs do really well in. Normally we'd like to see more of this stuff. We'd like to plant some native trees. But in this case, those trees shade out that grass, the stem density gets lower, so the egg survival you get under there is less than the egg survival you get over here. And so managing these inanga spawning areas in a particular way and in a different way to where we're probably going to, or how we're going to manage the rest of the waterway is important to focus on.
Can just while you're there,
yeah.
Is that what's the sort of optimum width of that grassed zone? A couple of metres there.
Yeah. So you could. More is better than less, but by the same token, you don't need acres worth of grasses to necessarily have enough space for the eggs to go.
So they'll migrate into that zone and continue on up as long as you've got a viable zone for them, is that?
Yeah, so they do seem like it's quite variable. So sometimes they'll use 3 kilometres of riverbank, sometimes they'll use 5 metres. So they seem to be fussy, but then sometimes they don't seem to be fussy. It's quite hard to predict where and when. And so I might come back to this a little bit later, but you could get quite excited and recontour this in the expectation that it's going to mean more spawning habitat is going to be used. Or you could just protect what's there naturally and see how that goes. And in that case, you know, it's a case of putting up a fence, which has already been done, and then pulling out these nio trees, which is already on the cards, and then just leave that and see how it goes. I wouldn't necessarily suggest we need to, you know, we wouldn't be able to, but, you know, if you could increase that area, lower it down a little bit and increase it, I'm not sure that would be something that we should prioritise.
But just sorry to pursue this. Along the Taipo stream,
yes,
there's a very narrow margin which is not mown,
yep,
and that's by arrangement.
Yep.
What is the optimum width we ought to be looking at in terms of desisting from mowing right up to the water's edge?
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So in that case, it'll be more a height thing rather than a width thing. So they'll be spawning on the spring tide, and that spring tide will get up to a certain level of the bank. So you want to go a little bit above that, all the way down to the water's edge. There's not much point, you know, worrying about this area up here because it's too high for the fish to get to. So I'd be, in terms of stopping the mowing, which is a great idea, like us getting out there and really confirming where and when we should or shouldn't be mowing would be helpful. But I'd base that decision on the height of the bank rather than the width. Yeah.
Andy, I'm assuming that Peter is going to have quite a few comments and observations to make.
Why would you think that?
Tell folks that at 1 o'clock we have a guest presenter, and if you wish to eat before 1 o'clock, we're going to have to deal with this issue.
I can eat quickly.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, actually, actually, I won't go into that detail. So there's a couple of things we can do. Remove those nio, that's already on the cards, and then these silver poplars. Again, these haven't been planted, but they're coming away there, and just maintaining these sites so that you've got better quality habitat for spawning is a high priority. And so that's one of the things, or two of the things that we'll do in the next 12 months. The operations guys are already on that. The guys uncovered a few fish barriers, and so again, we're just going to go in there and we can do that under our business as usual stuff for the next year. And then I guess the more, a slight change to what we're currently doing. At the moment, the way that you identify these spawning areas is you use the salinity pattern. So the blue is fresh, the red is salt. The inanga tend to spawn at the interface between that salt and fresh. So by going out and mapping this kind of thing, you can get a rough idea of where they're going to spawn. And then what we currently do, and what's been done in the past, usually because they've been, you know, begging for every dollar and every screw to build fences and whatnot. But what you then do is you can go out on the time that they're spawning, look for the fish, try to narrow down the area, and then you go back and you look for these eggs. So these are about 1 millimetre in diameter, so very small, and you've all been out to the Tukituki, just imagine that vista. There's a whole lot of grass to look through to try to find these things, and then you don't necessarily know when they're going to be there, so you might be looking at a time that they're not actually there. So that's quite an involved process, and I've called that the surgical approach, and which is good. Another thing we can do is actually just stop at this point, or at least go so far in this first stage and say, rightio, this is all potential spawning habitat. Let's protect it with a sort of a once light over type of approach, rather than getting too far down the track in exactly where we need to protect. And that more generous, more holistic approach to protecting is firstly a whole lot easier at the science, the upfront stage. We can map out those areas quite quickly, quite easily. And then it also just it gives you a bit of protection against any changes that might happen in the future. So the sea level's rising, so this is going to move up slightly. If we're focused it all down here, then if things change in the next 10 years, we're going to have to chase up later. And it also protects habitat, which is good for all sorts of other biodiversity reasons. So I'll be advocating for us to delineate areas more roughly to begin with, and then if it's a huge area, we need to go back, and also you want to go back and confirm that they are using areas somewhere within that. So it'll be a combination of the two. But in the first case, the next couple of years, we'll be trying to do the whole length of the coastline and map out the entire potential spawning areas for Hawke's Bay within existing budgets. And then the other thing that I've put in the paper is just monitoring. So at the moment, our fish monitoring is very limited. We don't have much resource for it. We've got more starting in year 2 of the LTP, which is good. And so when that happens, we're going to start getting out there and collecting more fish information. But we're never going to be in a position where it's a good idea for one of my guys to go down and catch, well, they would think it's a good idea, but catching whitebait for 3 months of the year, that's just too expensive, and it's not going to work. But there are already people who do that, like Councillor Bevan and others, and the limitations acknowledged, that will give us some indication of something that's going on in the environment, in the sense that they'll be catching things. There's a few reasons why that data will be very limited in its precision and quality. One is that whitebait is the success rate is actually not necessarily related to how many fish are there. So the whitebait catch that we get back doesn't necessarily mean that there's more whitebait. There's a theory that when the river's flowing high, the fish get pushed to the sides and they're more easily captured. And so that's what actually drives the capture rate rather than the number of fish coming in. And so that's that. And then there's also just the, I think at least a fair chunk of them are quite easy to work with, but there are concerns about how honestly we're going to get data back from them if they're selling it on the side and that kind of thing. So this is something that I'm keen to explore with the Whitebait fraternity, with DOC. So there used to be meetings held between the council and DOC, and they stopped about 20 years ago just with a bit of a change in structure and a change in focus. So we're proposing to start them up again, and we'll try for this August. And during that first meeting, we'll talk about this and just say, put it out there, what do you guys think about us providing you with a means of giving us data on the catch rate?
So I think when you say meeting with DOC, you mean also meeting with the white people?
Yes.
The stand owners?
Yeah, so it'll be a joint
permit holders?
Yeah, yep, the stand and any whitebaiter. So some people just do it on their own, like without stand.
Because the other benefit from doing that, even though the data's a bit sketchy, is that it socialises the problem, or socialises the issue with the whitebaiters at any rate. So they're at least aware of there's a concern and stuff.
Yeah, it's as much about engagement as it is about collecting data. But if it, I'll go to this plot later. But it's, there is some value in that data. It's not what we would normally do if we were the people collecting it, because we can't afford to do the way that we would do it. It's astronomically expensive to monitor a fishery like this. It's just crazily expensive. And then we're also going to start looking at the condition of those spawning shoals. So I mentioned that fish size is something that will really influence egg production. That's something that we can fit into, because that's a little bit easier to do. So we'll start doing that in year 2 of the LTP. And then we can see whether we really are observing an increase in fish size over the years. What that's driven by, again, it's one of these things that's hard to pinpoint, but it'll be something useful that we currently don't have now. And then just to wrap this all up in reality, so I've just made this data up again, and so I've just assumed that it's going to increase by 10 times between year 0 and year 50, but that's the kind of variability that we're probably going to see in terms of catch rate. So we get to here, and then because people's memory is short, and actually a lot of these people will have died off, they'll see. Really? Sorry, that's fishing the ones tomorrow. Not the most sensible way of saying it, but so we'll get to this point here, and the variability in catch rate, variability in fish, and then in catch rate, will mean that there's really large fluctuations. People will get disappointed at this point in time, but if we've got some data that can show the full history, that's where we can say, hey, look, this is just life. This is what this thing does. It's very variable, so that'll be quite useful. But it also highlights how difficult it's going to be to pick up trends, because even that would be reasonably good quality data, and we might not necessarily have that. So it's just we need to be realistic about what it's going to mean for us. And so just to summarise that, so DOC's fishery manager, but we're on track to enhance habitat for a number of whitebait species, and that's good for us. So we should try to monitor that so that we can talk about that as one of the key indicators of whether the life-supporting capacity environment's being maintained, whether the habitat's in good quality. But it will be SOE type monitoring, not fishery management type monitoring. So it's important for us to be clear on that as well. So there's, we've got a role to play here, and it's all about the habitat. And I think we're on track to achieving some pretty big wins in this space, so I'm quite excited.
Thanks, Chair. So thanks for that, Andy. It's exciting for me as well, because I know that the fishery is under pressure, and we've got to do what we can to support it. So look, just a question in regard to inanga and the range of species that make up what people describe as whitebait. And you're focused very much on inanga. Correct me if I'm wrong. Inanga are the ones where their breeding habitat is in those saline margins, and I don't know what the saline percentage is, but when the salinity is at a certain point entering freshwater, that's where they're likely to do their spawning. So, and it's possible to identify that habitat and make sure that it's protected so that that's where they'll go, right? On the other hand, there are a range of other whitebait species, but they don't spawn there. They spawn further up the river. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep.
So several other species that we probably need to be cognizant of and thinking about. So my question is, have we done any work on each of the river systems to know which are the species that are present and which ones are the predominant ones? Or is this just all about inanga?
Yeah. So there's been work done to characterise the composition of the catch, and for the most part, it is definitely primarily inanga
across all of our rivers.
Yeah, except for the Mohaka, where I think they got up to about 50% of Kwaro, and that reflects a different type of habitat that you get in the Mohaka, steeper, faster sort of stuff. And yeah, it's quite a tricky thing. So the inunga's easy in the sense that they migrate down to a position. So they're from a wide landscape they've concentrated. The other guys don't seem to do that. They seem to spawn closer to where the adults are. So you could use adult distribution to give you an indication of where they might be spawning, but that would just be an indication because there is evidence of subtle movements within that range as well. But in terms of what you would do if you did find that habitat, or if you did find the areas that they wanted to spawn, you'd be excluding stock and you'd be planting trees and you'd be looking after the riparian area as best you can. So in that sense, we're kind of already going down that track. So
right, okay.
Yeah,
Because the key is, Councillor, that's the current state, but it may well be a different one in the future.
Yeah, 50 years
Naturally,
ago,
it wouldn't have
different.
been. Yeah.
And in actual fact, I disagree with you with the Tukituki because I know from my personal experiences that 75% of what I catch is actually smelt, not
yes.
whitebait anyway.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know whether that's the case for other rivers in this area because the only other river I've ever fished in is the Nararora Clive, and I've probably only ever fished there 6 times in my life maybe. So,
yeah.
And I certainly caught smelt there, but I don't know whether they're predominant species or not. So
yep.
What's happened in the past year is that there was almost no smelt run at all.
Okay.
Tukituki, and that's what concerns me, that is actually the predominant species in that river, certainly in the latter part of the whitebaiting season. And I'm not quite sure what the causes are, and I think you've said in your paper they migrate much further up the river and spawn on sand, I think you said?
Yeah, so I should make a correction. So when I was talking about the whitebait composition, I was ignoring smelt. So that was just the migratory galaxids that's dominated by inanga. Smelt will be a contributor right along the region as well. And so smelt have a slightly different life history. They spend more time in the ocean, so they get to a bigger size out there. So they'll be more influenced by oceanic conditions and currents and all of that kind of thing. So they're probably even more likely to show large variability,
Okay.
and that will be difficult to get our heads around. They do spawn in the river proper, so they spawn in the little sandbanks and gravel bars and that kind of thing, but under the water. And so again, from the perspective of what do we need to do to look after the habitat, there's less there that's peculiar to smelt than there is to the whitebait species which spawn up on the terrestrial margins, and it gets a bit more impacted by what we're doing there. In terms of the river, it's the general, we need to maintain enough water in the river. We probably want to cool it down a little bit. We want to stop sediment getting into it. All of the things that we're already doing will benefit smelt. But because in the scientific community, the whitebait does tend to be focused on the galaxids, so there won't be as much information on the relative balance of smelt and galaxid whitebait. So that's something I'll chase up with Doc, actually. So yeah, because they've certainly got people working on this. There's one person doing a PhD on it at the moment, so I'll pass it on to them.
Any other comments, questions?
Lunchtime? Lunchtime?
Well, I was just going to observe, Andy, if you are thinking of coming back in the future looking for money, I would just give you a piece of marketing advice. It would be wise to include a little photo essay of little Petey Bevan fishing with his father 50 years ago to kind of pull at our heartstrings a bit. Otherwise,
You get my vote.
Have you got a photo?
Very comprehensive. It looks like there is plenty we can be doing, so it's great.
So I'm happy
Good
to-
for raising it. We can't adopt it. We can't approve it.
Oh, that's
We can't
right,
accept it.
either.
It's just a chat.
So look, just probably just a couple of other things before we go break for lunch. I'm quite keen. I presume you're going to do some sort of a survey with the people who are volunteer helpers,
Yep.
just to determine what the actions are that we're going to do in the next little while. I'd be very happy to come and have a look as well.
Thank you.
And I'd be happy to attend the meeting with the Whitebait stand owners too when you set a date. So
Good.
just let me know.
Good. That's great to know. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So we will break for lunch. We need to be, we can't hold these folks, I'm not sure who is presenting, but more than, I would say, 10 after.
Yep, that's
So
fine.
let's kind of move along. If we can invite them to join us
We
for
can
lunch.
probably invite them to join us for lunch because I suspect.